Welcome back. You're still watching The Globe. Now, this past weekend, the U.S. celebrated its Independence Day, and for many, this year's July 4th celebrations were different, not just because of COVID-19, but also because of the somber mood and protests that have followed the killing of African American George Floyd at the hands of the police in Minneapolis. Well, we go there now to get a sense of how immigrant Africans are feeling and also some of the challenges that they're facing in Minneapolis, a city which has the largest Somali community in the United States. And so we've asked Cawo Abdi, who's an associate professor at the Department of Sociology at the University of Minnesota and herself a Somali immigrant, to join us to talk to us about this via Skype. Cawo, thanks so much indeed for joining us, and welcome to the program.
Thank you very much for inviting me.
All right, Cawo, America celebrated Independence Day over the weekend. How did that play out for, let's talk about your community, Somali immigrants there?
I think it was a different type of 4th of July this year, not only for immigrants or Somali refugees in Minnesota, but I think for all Americans. There has been a reckoning, if you want, of racial injustice, structural violence. Some of the, I think, images that you saw in South Africa when the demonstrations that have lasted weeks following the death and the killings in the hands of the police of George Floyd. So I think nationally there has been a somber, as you put it, celebrations which were dampened because of COVID and the health. Health-based practices of social distance or of discouraging any types of gatherings, but also of, the racial tension and the reckoning and the demonstrations that continue around the globe of what the relationship between police and communities. Oftentimes, Somali Americans used to combine the celebration of July 1st, which is Somali Independence Day, and Somali Reunification, the South and North Day, with the 4th of July celebrations. So previous years, you saw a lot of families, young kids, and community organizations organizing events, outdoor events, and where a lot of young people would, or even adults would be carrying the Somali flag in conjunction with the U.S. flag. You did not have as much outdoor events this year, but I think it would not be too far-fetched or exaggeration to say this is a different year.
Yeah. All right. So what the George Floyd killing has shown many parts of the world, I think we had known, we'd heard about it, is the institutionalized racism in America, particularly in a lot of the police forces. And I wonder, the experience of the African American, is it the same for African immigrants?
What I would say is that there are a lot of similarities. A lot of the African immigrant communities and refugee communities, if we take, for example, Minnesota, you have a large Somali presence, but you also have large Liberian and Ethiopian populations. Oftentimes, these communities, especially the new arrivals, settle in areas that are predominantly African American. So you have not only the racial component of relationship with the law enforcement, but also you have the socioeconomic kind of location, the class location, that sometimes binds and brings together many minorities. By the way, we can also extend this to Hispanics, for example. So the relationship is both kind of connected in terms of how newer African immigrants and refugees relate to law enforcement. So there is a lot of commonality that they share with African American communities. But one could argue that the position of African Americans, those who came here, a few hundred years ago, those whose ancestors were brought here as slaves, have very much more, I think, much more difficult relationship with the police. But that relationship oftentimes also spills over to other immigrants who settle within neighborhoods that are predominantly African American, that are predominantly poor. And those neighborhoods, just by the mere fact of the racial composition and socioeconomic composition, are over-policed. Yeah. So that contact with the police and law enforcement happens is extensive, if you want, and also is fraught with a lot of a complex, I guess. There's complex dynamic that emerges. So similarities, but also I think some differences.
All right, similarities and differences, but how are African immigrants received by African Americans in America?
Well, that's a good question. I guess maybe the best way I can formulate is that there is definitely a larger kind of brotherhood, if you want, of identity that is shared, and then that, especially when we talk about leadership. So, for example, community organizations, there is kind of alliances that are built amongst community organizations, especially among kind of social movement type things. In terms of everyday lives, it would not be wrong to say that there are a lot of tensions. African Americans have been here for hundreds of years, and they still are excluded from a lot of opportunities, and the structural racism that is very much embedded in the law enforcement, in the courts, in kind of employment. Those are things that they experience every day. And definitely new immigrants experience that too. But there is some tension because African immigrants, or all immigrants, are often hailed as kind of harder workers. They are hailed as being, better people, if you want. They are often treated potentially a little differently and a little better than African Americans. So what that leads to is some tension of African Americans potentially feeling in reality that these people who are just coming to this country are getting more opportunities or might be treated differently by the majority mainstream population. And one area where you might see some of these tension, for example, is in high schools, where for a long time, and then there's a lot of community organization trying to work against this. Youth, African American youth, and Somali youth, and other African youth, oftentimes have a lot of tension, and there has been, fights, and then kind of, I guess, social media type narratives kind of pitting these two groups against each other. So again, it's the class component, the racial component, and I would argue even African refugees and migrants themselves sometimes repeating the narratives of the problematic African American. Kind of some of the some Africans themselves reproducing some exclusion or othering of African Americans, and that can lead to tensions and kind of problematics also.
That's fascinating. So it's difficult just being an African American, a black person in America. Do Somalis face yet another layer of discrimination because of religion, perhaps, and ethnicity, especially stereotyping after 9/11?
Absolutely. So Somalis are very much confronting, kind of being refugees, people oftentimes who have spent a decade or more, even 2 decades, in refugee camps in Kenya and Ethiopia, who have been displaced, by the way, sometimes in South Africa, who have been displaced and dispossessed by the conditions of war. And then when they come here, they, kind of join a country where there's a lot of racial tension and historical kind of structural kind of conditions that they joined, but that they, of course, were outside of. But they, of course, they have to navigate and manage that. In addition, since 9/11, you have the kind of the transformed naturalization and citizenship, kind of the emergence of homeland security, the emergence of securitization of law enforcement. the securitization of, by the way, remittances, money that families send for their extended networks, their families, their parents. So remittance companies, of course, now confronting major challenges to meet kind of anti-money laundering laws that have been in place. The infiltration and the securitization of mosques and places of worship. So you have kind of the racial aspect, the socioeconomic aspect, kind of the class, the refugee kind of legal category that they fall on, and then religion, and especially over the last few years, where we have a leader who openly, kind of criminalizes and problematizes the Islam itself, the religion itself. And so you have all those kind of fronts where the community feels that they have to kind of, juggle all those not only balls, but also try to do that while surviving economic problems that are emerging with COVID, for example, the economic and challenges and integration challenges that come because they're refugees. Many people still are learning the language. Many people have children who were born here, and you have some of the cultural kind of dynamics and cultural kind of disconnect between first generation young people who were born here and their parents who were born in Somalia, who came here as refugees. So, the community is kind of trying to engage in, or settle, integrate, find their footing with kind of multiple challenges confronting them in their everyday lives.
All right. Prof, I wish I could speak to you for much longer, but sadly we've run out of time. Fascinating talking to you. Thanks so much indeed for your time and your insights. Shukran.
Thank you so much for inviting me.
Okay, take care. All right. That was Professor Cawo Abdi, who's an associate professor at the Department of Sociology at the University of Minnesota. And she was also a research fellow at the University of Pretoria, who wrote a fascinating book talking about Somali immigrants who left Somalia, went to Dubai, went to America, and came to South Africa, and compared those different outcomes of those sets of Somali migrants. Perhaps another day we'll talk about that. All right.